It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Polly Neate as keynote this morning. Polly is Chief Executive of Women's Aid, and she's also a very active commentator on violence against women, sexism and feminism more generally, all of which are obviously incredibly important and relevant to POWs and particularly to the conference themes of this year. Polly's and Women's Aid are very active on Twitter. So I've put on the piece of paper there the details, so feel free to tweet through the course of the session. So at PollyN1, at Women's Aid, and hashtag HearMe, which is for the particular campaign that Polly's going to be talking about today. So I know I've seen lots of activity on Twitter so far in the conference, so it'd be really good if we could get this trending like we did last year, so that would be great. So Polly's going to talk to us about change that lasts, and we're very much looking forward to hearing her and then having time for discussions after. So thank you very much, Polly.
Thank you. I'm going to have to talk up here so that I can operate the thing. So it's very formal, but I hope we'll have a chance to have a bit of a discussion when I've finished as well, because it's a long slot and I can really assure you that I'm not going to speak for an hour, so don't worry about that. So what I'm going to talk about, I've also got a very irritating hay fever type cough thing, so I'm just apologising for that right up front. So, what I'm going to talk about is a piece of work that's really important to us at Women's Aid, that we've been doing for quite some months now, which is looking at change that lasts, what we're calling change that lasts, which is a strengths-based, need-led model that supports domestic violence survivors and their children to build resilience and leads to independence. Now, of course, in a lot of ways, this is what the women's sector has always been doing in response to domestic violence, but we believe that the dominant kind of paradigms, if you like, that are governing our response to domestic violence now have actually moved a long way from this. So, of course, there are still fantastic local organisations who are still doing this. But where the general thrust of the system is going, the general thrust of funding and the general thrust of policy up until very recently, I think now, partly I would, Women's Aid I think would, and I would claim credit for that actually, but I think we're in a bit of a policy hiatus now and there's an opportunity to turn a corner slightly, but I think for the last few years the thrust of policy has been very much away from this, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that in a minute. So rather than just continually, we are an organisation rooted in the needs of survivors, of women and their children, but we are also a very vocal and visible campaigning organisation, and that's a big important part of who Women's Aid is. And I think when you're a campaigning organisation, it's really easy to just moan about things. It's really easy to just go, oh, this is really bad, that's really bad, we hate this, we hate that, you know, we're anti this, we're anti that. And actually, yeah, we are anti a lot of things. but then we thought, well actually, let's be constructive, and instead of moaning about the way things are, what we really ought to be doing is proposing something different that has a real logic and coherence to it, which we really believe Change That Lasts does, and which we can create some momentum behind. So that was our so this is our positive response. And it is absolutely, before I get on to actually explaining it, the only other thing I want to say is that this is the result of a really extensive process of consultation with survivors and their children, but particularly with women survivors themselves. So we're just at the end of the second wave, so before we started the work we did a big piece of consultation to inform this, and then we've recently done another large bit of consultation to kind of test out our thinking so far. So it really is rooted in the experience of survivors, and not only survivors in contact with services. So we've also done a consultation using our online survivors forum, which is used by over 8,000 women, and is mainly, not only, but mainly women who have not yet made any contact with any, or well, they've got contact with reams of services actually, in fact that's part of what I'm going to talk about, but they haven't actually had any meaningful or useful intervention from any services in relation to domestic abuse. So it isn't only current service users we've consulted with, and I think that is important as well. Okay, so why do we need a new approach? Well, I guess what I was talking about when I was saying the dominant paradigm is a problem. I think what I really mean by that is the focus on managing risk. So basically, the way to get a service now is to be assessed as being at high risk, which means at high risk of being murdered, basically. Now, obviously it's important to identify whether women are in immediate danger or not, and women's safety is one of the most important needs, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But I think what's happened is that we've had, over the last few years, particularly since 2010, but actually somewhat before that too, to be politically neutral, and I think justifiably so in this case actually, somewhat before that too, we've had a coinciding of an increasing focus on risk management as the approach to domestic abuse from some quite dominant organisations in the field, and also austerity. And what happened, and also the advent of Twitter, and also the advent of some increase in commissioning and competitive tendering as the means of allocating funds. And what's happened is, I think it has genuinely been an unintended consequence to some extent of those three things together, is that if you tell people with an increasingly limited budget and an increasingly mechanistic process for allocating that budget, there's a pyramid here, and if you pick off the people at the top and do something for them, that's okay, tick, they will do it. And they'll do it partly because they don't understand domestic abuse anymore, a kind of really simple to follow thing they can do, and they'll partly do it because they need to save money, and they can see themselves just chopping off everything that's at the bottom of that pyramid and no longer funding it, which is of course exactly what has happened in many areas. The other issue about risk is that risk, as I'm sure you all know, risk is extremely fluid in cases of domestic abuse. And actually assessing it is not a simple matter. The way risk is assessed has far too much emphasis on violent incidents and far too little emphasis on emotional abuse, coercive control, and what is really the fundamental characteristics of abuse actually. And of course a woman, and this is not to talk down the importance of physical violence, but of course a woman can in a very highly controlling relationship for 15, 20 years with very little or even no physical violence. The day she decides to leave, she could be dead. Yeah. And that woman would never have been categorised as being high risk. So risk management has got a lot of problems. It ends up being short term, so once the risk's been managed, and I heard a devastating case. I was at, last Friday actually, I was at Savile Black Sisters, and just generally talking to them about work we're doing together and stuff like that. And I just heard about a case which absolutely sums up this short term thing. So this woman, she had been assessed as being high risk. All the support that she had was focused around the criminal justice system. And when her husband had bail conditions that meant that the risk was managed and had been fundamentally reduced, all the support that was funded for that woman melted away. This is an African woman. She was engaged with Savile Black Sisters, who were not funded at all to work in the borough where she lived. And once the bail conditions were lifted, he killed her. Oh, God. So, that's possibly an extreme example, but it does illustrate the level of short-termism that we're talking about if all we're talking about is managing risk, when risk is something that is, I would say, actually almost meaningless as a measure of severity of abuse. It's an issue for agencies, it's an issue for the criminal justice system, but it's not an issue. It isn't the paradigm we need to look at when we're looking at survivors. And the other thing that's happened is that it's privileged the criminal justice system above all other responses to domestic abuse. Now actually, if you talk to survivors, some survivors do see a criminal justice outcome, by which I mean justice being done towards the perpetrator, as something important. Very few of them see it as the overriding objective, actually. And even where they do, as I say, it isn't more important than a host of other things that are very important to them. It also, you know, as we well know, the majority of victims of domestic abuse don't contact the criminal justice system. So having the criminal justice system as the main point of entry into accessing support is quite pointless, really. And it isn't even true that actually those who are in the most severe need and the most severe danger are the ones that contact the criminal justice system. That's not true either. It's often the ones there's other reasons why women might be more likely than other women to contact the criminal justice system. They're not usually to do with the severity of the abuse that they've suffered. And the other thing that happens with risk management is survivors. I started off writing, as you can see, I sort of left it in here because I started off writing survivors feel blamed. Because very often what happens is we have a process where survivors are actually being asked to manage the risk. That a bunch of agencies sitting around a table have identified a level of risk that needs managing. And who's meant to manage it? The woman? It's like, what? So I started writing survivors feel blamed. I actually changed it then to survivors are blamed. It's not that they just feel it, you know. It's a bit like people go, it's a bit like feminism and patriarchy, isn't it? Like, we don't all just imagine patriarchy. Do you know what I mean? And dream it up. And that's why, you know, it's kind of like it is real, it's out there. And I feel a bit like that about this feeling blamed thing. Yes, survivors do feel blamed, but actually I sort of, what survivors said to us is, I feel blamed. What I want to say is they are being blamed, actually. And the risk should belong with the perpetrator. If you're going to have a meeting, all sitting around of professionals, with the person you're talking about not even allowed in the room, that should be the her, not the survivor. And I feel that really strongly. And I keep saying this, and I do get a bit of a mixed reaction, to say the least. But when I first came to Women's Aid, which was not that long ago, I only joined Women's Aid in February 2013, and I was sussing out the system, if you like. I couldn't believe that the woman is never in the MARAC meeting. Multi-agency risk assessment conference, for those of you aren't steeped in all this. I found that completely extraordinary. And it reminded me of what I've been much closer to in my career, is this world of sort of social care. It reminds me of the disability movement. Nothing about us without us. And I think there's something about that we really ought to be capturing and translating into women and survivors' experience of the system. So I'm going on and on, and I have to move. I'm in the inside one. So the other thing is, commissioners lack an overriding objective that can unite all agencies. So actually, what happens with managing risk being the overriding objective is not only survivors blamed, but the temptation for agencies to blame each other or to move that risk from one to the other is very, very high. And actually, it isn't owned by everyone as the overriding objective. Not surprisingly, it shouldn't even be the overriding objective. And recovery has become secondary. So many survivors, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this in a minute, are deemed intractable cases. They're not complying or they're not engaging with the system. And so the MARAC is kind of like hands in the air, oh my goodness, you know, we've discussed this woman several times and we're not getting anywhere. So some women are deemed intractable cases, in which case one might ask what's the point of the system in the first place. And others experience what I call the job done delusion. And that means, I was talking a bit with that terrible case I talked about earlier of the woman who was killed. Another example of that would be a woman I met who she had been in a highly controlling relationship for about 15 years. She had 2 children. Some of you would have heard this before, sorry. She had 2 children, a baby and a little boy of 3. And when she decided to leave the relationship, there had been a very, very serious physical assault. And she behaved exactly like this system wants you to behave, which we shouldn't be expecting women to be the perfect victim, but actually she was. So she engaged with the police. She was allocated, she was considered high risk, was allocated an IDVA support for the duration of the criminal justice process only, which is what generally happens. She was a very good witness. She's an articulate woman. She works as a PA, she's got a good job, and she's quite articulate, she's quite together. Long story short, the guy was convicted and he was sent to prison. But when I met her, that was when the support stopped. When I met her, she'd been prescribed antidepressants by her GP. She was really, really worried about keeping her job because she'd been spoken to several times at work about her attendance, and she was really, really struggling to keep going with her job, which was quite a demanding job. She was self-harming. She hadn't told any professionals. And perhaps most worryingly, she was feeling incredibly unconfident and concerned about her parenting of her 3-year-old boy and his behaviour, but also her reactions to it. And she said, I don't know why, but I just can't stop smacking him. Now, all of those challenges are a real natural response to what she'd been through and the fear and real danger she'd been living with for all of those years, but she was not getting any support. But she had support, and at the end, when support had finished, it'd been evaluated by her being asked, do you feel safer now? Of course, yeah, she did. She's not stupid. The guy's in prison. Of course she feels safer. But actually, has that woman really been helped towards recovery and been made safe, and have her children been made safe from that? So that's what I mean by the job done delusion. Somebody's ticked a box in relation to her that should never be ticked, and actually she's not in a good place at all. And the other thing that's happening is we're wasting money. I know you can't read these, so I know it's irritating. Don't get too irritated. What I want to show you is that if you want to get from Women's Aid, we've got 3 sample user journeys that show the immense cost in total of a risk-led approach for these women, and the much reduced cost actually of meeting women's needs at a much earlier point, really understanding their needs and meeting them through interventions that are not requiring senior managers sitting around a table. The average cost of a MARAC is £11,100 for one meeting. You could provide counselling and support for a woman for a considerable period of time for that thing. So we are really wasting money on this risk thing. And the other thing we were really influenced by was some recent findings, which you probably all know about because you're much more academic than I am. But basically, this piece of work in Middlesbrough was just fascinating. So I was talking about women being deemed intractable, and they took 39 of these women. They had 69 children, 20 of whom had already been removed from these women. It's a whole other thing. They had some level of engagement, but they'd had at least 2, usually more, presentations at MARAC where nothing had happened. So they'd all basically been told, if you don't leave, your children are going to go into care again, in some cases. And they weren't leaving, they were completely paralysed really by the engagement or non-engagement that they were getting from services. And what happened was, they took a person-centred approach. They took what we're advocating, a strengths-based, needs-led approach, working alongside these women, and 31 out of the 39 cases saw a measurable improvement. That was within 6 months. And actually, they're still working with them now. And this is a significant time later, so no one's promising a quick fix here, but actually all the cases now have seen a measurable level of improvement. And even on criminal justice measures, there was a significant 65% reduction in reported repeat incidents. And bear in mind, obviously there was a previous unwillingness to report incidents, so even with the previous under-reporting, there was still a significant reduction. And 15 had no more incidents at all. Now, from the place these women were in, that's a massive improvement. And it's really interesting. There's still an element of blaming herself, isn't there, in that quote? I don't know why I didn't accept help before. I just couldn't cope. I can't believe how low I got, but I'm getting there now. Well, she didn't accept help before because it wasn't being offered in a way that was acceptable. I don't mean acceptable as in okay, but acceptable as in literally able to be taken up, you know? And it's no good talking about, and we hear an increasing discourse around this risk-led model about what do we do about the women who won't leave or don't want to leave. That's a big topic at the moment. I hear that in government all the time. And it's like, well, let's just go back a bit there, because not wanting to leave is only real if leaving is a real choice. Yeah. Talking about a woman not wanting to leave is really, really dangerous discourse, I think, for anyone but her to get into. And it definitely is a dangerous interpretation of a woman's situation when all you're doing is measuring the level of risk she's suffering and sticking a marrow meeting around the table. You know, that is not understanding whether a woman is able to leave or not. And the same study, this massively influenced us in moving ahead with change at last, and you can see why, because a shift away from a risk-based model that creates defensive decision-making and disempowers agency staff. Yeah, it doesn't only disempower women. Those people around the table aren't empowered, they're not actually empowered to do what they're employed to do, which is save money. Interesting view, sorry. So the other thing we were really interested in, and that influenced a lot, was a fantastic piece of work by Liz Kelly and her colleagues in partnership with Solace Women's Aid, which is a big women's aid service in London, for those who don't know. And they tracked 100 women and their children over 3 years, so a massive piece of work. And you can have my presentation afterwards, you can read all of this. But the key thing that really influenced us was the current policy focus on short-term risk reduction contributed to this misunderstanding. That's basically a misunderstanding of the impact of coercive control and actually of domestic abuse itself and how long-lasting its effects are. Okay? So the current policy focus on short-term risk reduction contributed to this misunderstanding and the failure to recognise women's current and persisting support needs. I would say women aren't even being asked about their current and persisting support needs, and that's what we have to change. So we think, and this is what we have heard from survivors, is the goal, if you like. Sustainable safety and well-being for themselves and their dependent children, which can be maintained with maximum reliance on own resources, and that means both personal resilience and so on, and family and community, and minimum reliance on external resources, depending on individual circumstances and need. So what we mean by that is we want all agencies at local level to be working together to this goal for survivors, not the goal of managing the risk that they face. The goal of managing the risk ought to be governing perpetrator work. This is the goal that ought to be governing work with survivors. And I don't make any apology, by the way, for the fact that this is in some ways couched in let's appeal to the government, central and local, cost-saving terms. Because there are real cost savings to be achieved here. If women are able to be independent, that's what they want. And it's what we all want as a community around them. What we all want is to maximise our own level of independence. And if we think about what that means for us individually, I would be classed as being somebody who's independent, but I'm not completely independent of drawing on any external resources. I use the NHS, my children go to school, I use all kinds of public resources that meet my needs. But what I also have, and have been enabled to have through lots of different things in my life, is sufficient resources within myself and within my community that I can be as independent as possible given my level of need. And that's what women want. So we've done a theory of change, which if you're interested, I'll give you the email address at the end, you can get off Women's Aid. So we've got more of a, I don't know if you're aware of like theory of change and how it works, but basically what you have to define is the impacts that you're trying to achieve to start with, and then you kind of work backwards from that. So survivors achieving long-term independence and freedom from abuse, children safe and protected from harmful influences, and services used effectively, reducing the long-term cost of domestic violence and abuse. So what we want to achieve in terms of outcomes, and this is what we're talking to local areas about, though, looking at piloting the model. So first of all, we believe that we need communities that are open to hearing and believing and responding appropriately to disclosures of domestic abuse at a much earlier stage. And that is not all about the criminal justice system. That's really about a cultural change, but it can start in particular community locations where we would have people, individuals who are trained and supported to ask safe inquiry, to believe and listen to women with a sufficient understanding of domestic abuse to be able to signpost a woman to the appropriate next point for help. That's all it is. But backed up by then awareness campaigns locally, which would specifically signpoint to this local scheme, which we're calling an Ask Me scheme. So that's what we want to develop. And that needs to be developed in really, really close consultation with local survivors within that area. So it only works, and we can provide access in the local area to that through local women's aid services. So what has to happen is ask women, particularly women who are in or have been in highly controlling relationships, where is your space for action? Or where was your space for action? Is there one place where you could be without the perpetrator? And that's where we need people to understand about safe inquiry and be able to hear, believe and signpost. And that's where we need to locate the Ask Me scheme. And in terms of awareness, actually, it sounds like, awareness campaigns always sounds like millions of pounds, but actually I can tell you, every police force, almost every local authority in the country is already spending money on awareness campaigns around domestic abuse. There's no unity of message. They're not actually pointing anyone in the direction of anything particularly useful. It's normally the police. And actually, there's no evidence in most cases. In fact, the only awareness campaign I know of, and there's any evidence that it has an impact, is actually the Home Office's, to be fair. This is abuse campaign, which was specifically aimed at young people, and it had that tie-in with, what's that programme, Hollyoaks. And actually, I've seen evidence that did have an impact. I've never seen any evidence that other awareness campaigns have actually had an impact in terms of increasing reporting and reducing domestic abuse. But I think that's because partly they tend to use like really ridiculous imagery and victim blaming messaging, but also it's because they don't have anything kind of concrete to point women to. So community level response mechanisms must be active and effective. Once that's happened, we need to make sure that each contact that a woman has is an opportunity and isn't a place where another barrier is put in her way. What often happens is that every professional that she contacts is putting up another barrier. That then leads to, obviously, an understanding of and meeting the particular and individual needs of survivors, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And that means survivors being empowered to draw and build upon their individual strengths and resources. That's what I was talking about before. So it is about not only meeting needs and defining people in terms of their needs, but understanding people's own resources and strengths as well. And often, survivors have actually been managing the situation for many years, drawing on those strengths and resources, and it's about understanding that and enabling them to build upon that. Children provided with a home and community environment within which they're able to thrive, and perpetrators held to account and provided with opportunities to change their behaviour. So that's the outcomes that we aim to achieve through Change That Lasts. So the outputs then, in order to achieve those outcomes, what we think we need to do. So I've talked about the awareness raising, leading to Ask Me, in key community locations. What I forgot to say about that actually was that when we talk to women in the local area, it's going to be really important to talk to women from all communities within that area, because a safe location within one community. So for some groups of women, a place of worship may genuinely be a safe location for Ask Me. For other groups of women, it may well not be. For example, that's just an example, some women, a local shop is not a safe space, but others it is. In the FGM piece of work that's been done, there's been a lot of work around minicab companies, not FGM, sorry, child sexual exploitation. There's a lot of work around minicab companies and making them aware of how they can spot children and young people that are at risk of sexual exploitation. I don't know enough about CSE to know whether that's a good idea. I do know in domestic abuse that minicab companies may very well, in many communities, not at all be a good idea. So that we need to really talk in detail in that area to women and understand where their space for action is and what is safe. And the other thing that we're developing is with local services, both with local services and with other agencies that we believe might have to be able to perform a strengths and needs assessment. So some children's agencies, drug and alcohol agency, for example. So other places where women might enter the system. So we're developing a tool for assessment of strengths and needs. And that's what we're saying then, the plan with that woman ought to be based on. And then the other thing we believe, and this again comes from women, that term trusted professional is, I'm not sure how good a term it is, but it's the term that's come out of the consultation with survivors. And it's what they would describe as somebody that they're able to develop a trusted relationship with, who they trust is a professional, knows what they're doing, but who they have that relationship with, and critically that relationship has some longevity. So what we're looking at is understanding who could potentially perform that role according to survivors' needs. So for some survivors, that is going to have to be a domestic abuse specialist working within dedicated specialist services. For other women who may already be in contact with, let's say, a drug and alcohol service, who might have a very supportive, trusted relationship with someone within that service, we want to explore whether that person could play that role. And there could be a variety of professionals that women have contact with who could play that role, which is about standing by the woman and helping her to navigate her way through the myriad agencies and services that she has to come in contact with, which can be completely bewildering. So it's about somebody standing alongside. And then obviously there has to be needs-led, dedicated, community-based support. So the services, this is the specialist domestic violence sector, and that needs to be in place within the local area in order to support women who need that level of support. And it'll be really clear if we actually implement change that lasts in a local area, it will be really clear then how many women actually need that support and what does need to be in place at that level of service. At the moment, that's complete guesswork. Commissioners have got no idea actually what the real level of need is in their local areas. And clear guidance for agencies on their responsibilities for managing perpetrator risk. And we're working with Respect, which is an organisation that works specifically with perpetrators. That's not what Women's Aid specialises in doing. But it is important that we place the risk where it belongs, which is with the perpetrator. So what we're doing at the moment is that we have got an advisory group that we've been working with all along that includes everyone on here and more actually. It's a very wide group and we've been using their knowledge and experience to develop the model so far. We're continuing to use them to test it out and make sure that it's really fit for purpose in practice. We're still doing some consultation. We are still in, particularly the children and young people consultation is still in progress. The survivors, we've done another phase of that now, and that's already fed in. We're consulting with local services as well. And we're exploring opportunities to pilot the model, so we're talking to quite a number of local areas, commissioners in local areas, who are genuinely interested in seeing how they can put this into practice. And I think the really important thing about Change That Lasts is that, yes, it does involve doing things differently and spending some of your money differently at local level. I would really strongly argue it doesn't involve spending more money. And also, it's an approach. It doesn't mean throw the entire system up in the air, stop doing everything you're doing and do something completely different. What we're saying to local areas is, work with us to test out this model. Let's evaluate it, let's look at its success rate, let's look at the outcomes women and children achieve, and let's look at the cost of it. But we can be quite flexible in terms of what's already in place within a local area. So the local landscape for the Ask Me scheme, the local landscape of where those key services are, where the trusted professional might be situated, that is going to vary from area to area. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's a blueprint that we believe local areas can use to radically improve outcomes for survivors and their children. And we're doing a specific consultation with commissioners. We're going to set up a commissioners group, but we're just waiting to finalise where the pilot areas are first before we do that. So, this really is very naughty because the last bullet point, the conference has actually happened, which really goes to show that I didn't go back and edit it after the conference. So I'm really sorry. So if you want any more detail, you can get the theory of change diagram. We've got loads more information on change analysis. There's a lot of much more detailed information than I presented here. The infographics that I showed you, the user journeys, all of that you can get. You just have to email Women's Aid. If you want to, in your local area, talk about change that lasts and potentially implementing it in your area, and you can get some interested groups around the table, we would be more than happy to come and talk to you. That's what we're doing at the moment, and is going around local areas talking. We do have quite a few areas that are interested in piloting, so I'm really optimistic that out of that will come. At the moment, because of resources, we can probably only do full pilots in 3 areas, but if areas can bring their own resources to the table, then we can look at doing it more widely than that. So that's it.
That's excellent, thank you. I'm sure I've got some comments and some questions for you.
Yeah. All right, I stand up in silence.
I really like this, and I really like the fact that you want to tap into women's own resources in their community. Because my research, I'm looking at young people who've grown up in homes affected by domestic violence, and my research clearly shows that if they strongly identify with their family, it gives them beneficial psychological resources, which has some, it increases their well-being. So, I mean, there's so many resources that are simply out there that they can tap into without having any cost.
Yeah.
But it's really important because there's so much shame and secrecy around domestic abuse that people, families ignore it.
Yeah.
And that resource that's there is not being tapped into.
Yeah. And I think there's also, I didn't talk about this, but I think there's a role for sometimes engaging the wider family as well,
Yes.
and sort of working with them in order to support the survivor and the children in that situation. And often families feel very, and sometimes they're not helpful at all and they're part of the problem. Totally accept that. But other times that isn't the case, and actually families feel incredibly disempowered by a system that is so criminal justice focused as it is at the moment. If you talk to, really, it's very sort of distressing. If you talk to families of women who've been killed, what they often say is that they had no understanding really of what was really going on, and there wasn't anybody involved in that woman's life, even if the police were involved, that was able to kind of bring together the resources that she has around her. And I think if that could happen more, it'd be really beneficial. So yeah. And you're right about the cost as well. That's why I think this trusted professional role is so important. Because it's somebody who can support a woman to access resources, not all of which are incredibly expensive. Not at all.
I really like the idea of the trusted professional. I work in a women's prison, and domestic abuse comes up all the time. And what's particularly concerning is that women are being released into homelessness quite frequently. because nothing's been sort of set up. And what I've noticed in the prison, what happens is that there's a whole bunch of services that happens before women go into prison, and then whilst they're in prison, there's a completely different set of services that get involved, and so having a more sort of continued model of care, because the sort of fragmentation of services really doesn't help women in these situations. And I just wonder what your involvement is with women who end up in prison, because
we've done quite a lot of work with one of our local women's aid service in London called Advance, that runs a specific piece of work for women offenders. So we have done some work on that, probably not as much as we should by the sounds of it, I would say. That's really useful, because we should look at that, definitely. And I think one of the issue for women coming out of prison, and that's who Advance work with, is trying to help women to be safe when they come out of prison. And so we have looked at that a bit, yeah. But you're right, it's a group with very particular needs and very severe needs.
I'm Debbie, I work from Manchester, and we've just done some research on marriage. And one of the horrifying points for us was that most of our domestic homicides in Manchester have never gone near marriage.
I don't know how it started, I know.
And that whole idea of that top 10% of people going through this process, and arguably not even giving consent to do that as well. I mean, in our division in Manchester, I think the average is 8 minutes per case. So the assessment happened within 8 minutes, and we interviewed people who said, what are we going to do with the kids in this case? And someone else would say, this case hasn't got any children. Yeah. So that whole that notion of assessment is it needs completely readdressing, and this is, I'm not seeing your presentation before, but it was really, really useful to look at that strengths-based approach, absolutely. Because asking someone if they're safe as well doesn't necessarily mean that they're safer either. So that whole risk assessment model really needs to be
it's a real worry
addressed.
And actually, in a way, asking somebody if they're safer isn't, when they've been in a life-threatening situation, it's not what most of us would see as the foundation for a stable life. Just, are you safer than you were when your life was at risk? Well, yeah. It's like, it's sort of just not any kind of measure of anything, for that individual. Yeah, I've seen that research actually. Is that the stuff that was in the Guardian yesterday?
Yes.
Yeah, I tweeted that actually. I thought it was, and I'm trying to. I don't know what's happened to it. I wrote because I'm mad. I love Twitter and blogging and all that kind of thing. And I've written a blog actually building on it, kind of saying, I'm trying to get Guardian. If Guardian won't publish it, I'm just going to stick it on my own Huffington Post thing. But kind of saying, look at what this research is saying. So I kind of tried to do a blog, sort of taking it on, because I thought it was fascinating. And it just tackles so much of what we're saying about the limitations of MARAG. But it's so embedded. They're not statutory in a way. There's no actual compulsion. There's no legal duty to have a MARAG.
We need to make in Manchester about how we're going to implement things. Because I work for the helpline and Independent Choices helpline in Manchester too. There's a lot of us as a big voluntary consultant.
I know, I've been up there talking to them. I know.
So hopefully.
Yeah, because we supported that consortium coming together. Women's Aid did. And it's very exciting.
What you said about trusted professionals working with women over a long period of time really rang true with me. I work with a charity. We support young people and have recently been supporting more young women, mainly support young men. And it's taking that time to really build that trusting relationship, which perhaps in the past hasn't been possible due to financial constraints, but when you think about the long-term consequences of not taking that time to build that trust.
Yeah, and I think there are financial constraints if you see it as a new thing.
Yeah.
But I think there's a real merit. What we're trying to do is look at that really flexibly. So look at that as a role that someone can play in a woman's life, and what equips someone to play that role, what training and support would they need to play it, rather than introducing a whole new job. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That, you know, it's not about starting something from scratch, it's about building what is already there, but looking at how can we build that continuity. And actually, weirdly, one of the things that really influenced us in that role, and I just know everyone's just going to be like horrified, but was actually the Troubled Families programme. Because where, I know there's a lot of criticism of the Troubled Families programme, I completely get why, but where it works really well, actually, it is about one professional, one person, very assertive, but who really is alongside that family. And actually, in Troubled Families, in practice, it normally is a woman, it's normally the mother. And who genuinely, if they're doing it well, they do work alongside them and help them to navigate the plethora of different agencies and professionals that they have to come in contact with. And if you go to Birmingham and Solihull Women's Aid are delivering, they're contracted to deliver the Troubled Families programme. And that's like fascinating, because obviously they're doing it from a women's aid, feminist, women-centred point of view. And they're doing it with a massive amount of domestic abuse expertise. And actually it's very close to some of what we're talking about in Change That Lasts. So so we've tried to kind of draw on models that already exist, and that where they work well, I think we can really learn a lot. I'll tell you what else in terms of, I just remember what I was going to say, can I just go back to the NOAC thing really quickly? It's just because we've been working quite a lot with the LGA, Local Government Association, and ADAS, Association of Directors of Adult Social Services, and they've issued a new piece of guidance called Making Safeguarding Personal. And it's about safeguarding vulnerable adults in response, and it's about implementing the CARE Act. And what's really interesting there, it's a way of being implemented in full, and there are some struggles with it. But if you look at it, what it is proposing is a different way of looking at promoting the safety of an autonomous adult that involves that person, and that really takes into account their individual circumstances, strengths and resources, and their needs, and what long-term recovery looks like for them. And if you look at that, there's Making Safeguarding Personal guidance. It's on the LGA website, Local Government Association website, and a toolkit, Making Safeguarding Personal toolkit. And we've been really influenced by that as well in the development of Change That Lasts. But I think it's also a very interesting model that provides a challenge to NOAC, which is the most impersonal thing you could imagine. And actually, they really, it's very interesting to me why are women who've experienced domestic abuse the people that we make decisions about without consulting them at all? Why is that? There's not that many groups actually in this day and age that we do that with. And why are women survivors one of those groups? It's really I don't know what the answer is, but I'm sure it's not going to be pleasant. It might have something to do with patriarchy, I'm not entirely sure.
Something to do with stereotyping these women as passive as well.
Yeah.
Because they let this happen to them.
Exactly.
In a sense.
Exactly. And it's about blaming, it's about victim blaming. And then people have said to me, oh, but these women have got such complex needs, they can't engage. What? I can't believe that. I've met all loads of things. It's just not the case. It just isn't true. And also, if you look at Making Safeguarding Personal, that is about engaging people with high support needs, with very complex needs, in decisions about their future. So we can do it.